Hello and welcome to Beyond Our Voices. This is the very first episode in our series. We want to go beyond our voices, beyond our stories, to a place of healing. And our very first episode today starts with the power of telling your story, because we believe that that's really where the healing process starts, in the telling of our stories, so that we can learn to process and unpack any trauma that has happened in our lives. So our very first guest today is Melinda Ferguson, who wrote this particular book. In fact, this is the very first edition, I think, Smacked. She wrote this over 20 years ago, and it still holds power today. It's still being sold. Melinda, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure, and it was actually 16 years ago.
Was it 16 years ago that you wrote the book?
That I had it published.
And even after 16 years, it's I know it's been there are various editions, there are various covers, and but it's still selling. What does it tell us about the power of our stories? Why is it still selling after all these years?
I think it was such a gritty, honest book. I don't think I was the most honest book that had ever been published in South Africa, but I like to think so, that I was one of those people who took all my dirty laundry, threw it all over the page, told things about addiction, something that was really taboo then, things about being a heroin addict, being a drug addict mother, the trauma of what I put my family, my friends, myself through. And I think people were captivated by a bare honesty and the telling of the truth, of my story.
And did you think, when you wrote it, that you'd still be talking about it 16 years later?
Never. And to be honest, there have been times that I've gone, really, do people still want to carry on talking about it? I've had a bit of a new lease of life, because I brought out my 20-year clean and sober edition. That's where you get the 20 years from. And I think that has given it a bit more life, because I added a chapter on healing and recovery. And so it's been an ongoing process, but I'm always amazed that people...
Yeah, because there's a power to other people's stories as well, isn't it? It's sort of almost like we know we're not alone.
Well, I think when you tell your story, and you know from your own book, Brutal Legacy, that when one tells something that is a universal thing, of truth, of pain, there are so many people that have the same experience, but they don't have the vehicle to tell it on. And if you become the storyteller, there are so many people who relate. And even if they're not addicts, or they haven't been had domestic violence in their life or something like that, there are elements in all of our lives as human beings that we can relate to. So it's a great connector, I think.
Now, I know the question I'm probably most asked from my own book is, has it been a cathartic experience? And that's what I really want to unpack, is why do we inherently know that telling our story is a cathartic experience? Because I certainly never set out to do that. Did you set out to heal when you wrote your book?
I set out to make a confession, because I'd done so many bad things, and I was full of shame as an addict, as a heroin addict, as a mother who had been a drug addict, all this taboo stuff, all things that I literally thought I would have reason to kill myself for. And so it wasn't really catharsis I was looking for. It was more about trying to explain what had happened, and more than anything to myself. Because primarily I went really inwards when I wrote the book, and I didn't really think of the audience. I know we always get told, think of the reader. I was not thinking of the reader. I was thinking of Melinda, needing to unpack so that if I did jump off a building afterwards, at least I'd have told my truth. But what happened as a offshoot of the telling of truth, that there was a long process of catharsis. And I don't think the catharsis just happened, didn't get the book out and was like, oh, I'm all resolved. It was more of a years later, the slow healing of, okay, I'm okay. I've let go of a lot of shame. The book holds my shame. The book holds my pain. The book holds the guilt. And in a weird way, it starts allowing you as a human being, as a person, as the writer, to free yourself.
So it really is the first step in the healing process.
It is.
What did Maya Angelou say? There's no greater agony than an untold story sort of buried inside of us. And I think that's what it is, because it sits and it festers, doesn't it? If you think that the average rape survivor takes 7 years before they tell one other person, so it sits inside of us. So let's just try and unpack that whole thing. You didn't only tell your own story. You've written a couple of memoirs. You've had many stories to tell, but you've also told the story of other people, because you publish other people's stories. So you've been able to be a participant and an observer in this entire process of people telling their stories. What if you sort of recognized most? What did you learn most about telling a story, or what have you noticed most about other people telling their stories when it comes to empowering themselves?
I think that there are so many people in South Africa that are traumatized, and there are so many people that have gone through unusual pain. I mean, we are a country of such great contradiction. We are beautiful and scenic and wonderful, and we're violent and very, very dark on some levels. And so I think that I've seen this, I get so many submissions from people. There's this desperate need for people to be seen and to be recognized and to be, in a way, noticed. Because I think in the noticing of someone's pain, and that is in the telling of the story, it's as though you have some kind of resolution, that there's some type of, that you're not just anonymous in your pain and you're not just anonymous in your experience. So I think for me, having been the carrier of, I probably have published about 50 memoirs. I mean, I've published about 60-something books, but primarily memoir. It's been wonderful to see people like you, people like Sarah Jane McQuarrie King, Desiree Ann Martin, people who have come with their precious truth and story, and suddenly the doors have opened to some type of acknowledgement. And I think that's what it is all about. Not the
No, because
fans.
I think as a victim, very often you're dismissed, certainly. You're ignored.
Look what happened to you.
Yeah,
I mean, that's what happened to you. For so long, it was like the courts weren't believing you, or it wasn't even about belief, it was about the blocks that were put up for you as the victim instead of the other way around.
And I think the moment someone listens to you is the time that you think, well, actually, I do matter.
Yeah.
Because until that point, you don't matter. So you've told your story now. I mean, let's not create the impression that you tell your story and you're on a positive path forward. It doesn't always work like that. I mean, you can vouch for that.
Yeah, and I mean, I've written 3 memoirs, and each time I write one, I think, geez, look how screwed up you still are. You know, there's a constant unlayering of the self. And I think that I always tell people, the publishing is one thing, but not everybody has the luxury of being published, and it isn't vital to be published in order for you to have the catharsis. To write in your own little book, in a notebook, or on your little PC or whatever, your story, that in itself, the relationship between you and the word, is an incredibly a journey of self-knowledge and a journey of catharsis. So, gosh, I think I forgot what you were actually asking me.
I'll go back to it.
I just went off on a bit of a...
No, but what you're saying now as well is very often we don't also have the words. We don't find the words. So you're right. Not everybody is going to write their story. Not everybody wants to write their story. They don't want everyone to know about it. But what is that sort of unleashing? I'm going to come back to the question just now. But what is the unleashing? What is the power in the unleashing of the story? What happens in the brain? What happens in our body? What happens in our emotions?
I really do think a deep thing happens. And it is like the deeper inner self that is needing to speak somehow gets connected with. And you know, when you go into one of those kind of almost hazes where you are actually almost in another consciousness, and you can write for 2 pages and you get out of it and you go, what happened there? And you read what you've written and it is telling you something that you were not totally conscious of. So, I mean, it sounds very woo-hoo, but I think messages are given to us through if you're brave enough to go into that place of the unspeakable, in a way, of the shameful, of the not recognized, an amazing, almost magical thing starts happening where you start healing. And healing is what I think we're all needing to do from whatever's happened to us. Human beings, I think, are here to heal. In whatever age we've been born into, I think we've always been struggling with the things that we, as a kind of archetype, struggle with. So people have always been suffering, and the suffering needs to make sense, because otherwise, what's the whole point?
So let's say you're not going to write your story necessarily, but what is even just thinking about your story, because history, I mean, our memories are stored in fragments, and I think when you write, you have to then sit and condense and bring all your memories together, and through that you get the understanding. But let's say you're not going to write your story necessarily. So do you think thinking has its own power? Do you think you're able to then also step back from your story and analyze it from a distance?
I think what happens with thinking about it, it sometimes becomes like a tumor. I've heard so many writers who haven't written a word, or people, not even what you could call a writer, people who say, I have to write my story. Then I go, so do it. And then there's this resistance. It's the scare, the fear of having to actually sit down in the discipline of having to do that. But the more they think about it, in a way, the more it's trapped. And the kind of tumor of the trapped, untold story starts getting really pressurizing. And I always say, well, just write a little bit of it. So I do think it needs, for it to actually, manifest in a place of actually release, it actually needs to be written. The other thing that might help people is that they record themselves. So put a little thing on your phone, your dictaphone or whatever, and speak your story. I sometimes think that has a similar kind of effect. But if it just stays locked in the brain, I don't think much happens in terms of healing.
So did you find healing? I mean, I know you said it's a long journey.
Yeah.
It is a long journey.
I found a lot of healing from much of the shame that I dealt with, specifically as a mother. As a mother addict. I think that was, if anyone had to say, what is the most shameful thing you did? It was being pregnant and taking drugs while I was a pregnant mother to be. But that's been a long process, because every time I think I'm healed, then something happens and I go, there's still a bit more to do. But if you look at on a continuum, I'd say that like an amazing amount has been done. But I do think that we continue to heal. And I think as soon as we think we are totally better, we get told, no, not yet. And we carry on.
So the question earlier on was, telling your story doesn't always guarantee you a positive response.
In fact, it often elicits a negative response. And that's human nature. So one of the biggest questions I get from my authors, and I think you also asked me that, almost, I'd say all of them ask me, what are they going to say? What is my mother going to say? What is the man I'm talking about going to say? What are the people in my life going to do when they read what I tell? And there is that wonderful Anne Lamott quote that, if they'd treated you better, they should have treated you better, and then you would have written better things about them. That's paraphrased. But so I think there is risk. I think you have to be brave. I think you have to. I tell people to write as though the world is dead. You don't have to leave it like that. But for you to get the absolute catharsis, you have to tell the truth. You can't sugarcoat certain people. You can't sugarcoat certain experiences for you to get the cathartic experience. It's all about the truth, and there is risk in telling the truth. I myself have had...
So even if you're not writing a book per se, and you're working in your own space at home, and you're trying to heal from your own trauma, I suppose you've got to accept that there will be a negative...
You might want to sit down with your mother and say, this is what happened to me with you as my mother in childhood, and this is how I experienced you, and your mother might jump up from the table, throw her teacup on the floor, and never want to speak to you again. Those are the risks we take. But I think that when families or when people do come together and tell the truth to each other, then that's an amazing thing, and healing does take place. Healing will never take place unless we confront the thing.
So what advice would you give to someone who has a story inside them, not to write it, but just to release it from themselves?
I would say set aside time, almost very much like journaling. Wake up in the morning or go to sleep before you go to sleep at night and start writing a page. See where it leads you, because writing leads you into other places. I mean, none of us know what we're going to write at the beginning, unless you're writing a crime detective novel or something like that. But when you're writing, self-writing, the writing tells you where you need to go. And I know people who've been writing a book for 13 years, 14 years, and they can't stop. Because because it becomes like your friend, your confidant, you're the only one who knows really the truth. So I would just say start and see where the journey takes you.
Just as a tool for healing.
Yeah.
Using writing as a tool for healing. Now, we can't change the past. So what does telling our story do to us?
I think it teaches us why we did possibly what we did, why we made decisions. Because sometimes you go, how the hell could I have been with that man? or chosen that
Or woman,
path,
or
or
whatever.
women, or whatever. How could I have done that? But by writing about it, you start actually almost trying to find a way to understand yourself, to forgive yourself. Because we all make decisions not always rationally and not knowing what the future is going to unfold. And you can't change the past, but if you understand what's happened, you might be able to prevent yourself from doing the same thing again, which I think is one of the biggest lessons I've learned. Writing about my addiction and what I did in order to get drugs was so clarifying for me, the insanity of what I did to get a little bit of crack or heroin. It's been a great leveler for me to say that I can never return. It would make no sense for me to return because I understand what happened.
Melinda, thank you for being a part of the very first episode of our Beyond Our Voices series. Just as a little gift, we would like to give you a T-shirt, which was painted by Picasso, the painting pig. That's his artwork, her artwork. It's actually called Unchained, and she doesn't support domestic violence, but she did this for us, for our cause. But thank you for being on the show, and this is a gift from us to you, and thank you very much.
It's beautiful. Thank you, Tracy.
Well, next time, join us again here on Beyond Our Voices, and of course you can go to our YouTube channel as well if you'd like to subscribe so you'll know when the next interview comes out. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.